Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to install Debian 10 on a VirtualBox hypervisor. What I thought I'd show folks today is how I set things up with my own VirtualBox environment for testing open source systems and open source software and other web applications that I work on. And what I like to do is have a base server set up. I've had one for a while on VirtualBox, but I'd kind of like to start from scratch. So as I go through that process, I thought I would share with people what my environment looks like. You could use it for anything, but I was really kind of thinking that if people follow along with my other videos, having this information would be pretty nice because they'd be able to follow along in an environment that actually mirrors exactly how I've set things up. So to get started, the first thing we'll need to do is get the virtualization hypervisor. So VirtualBox is what I'm using in this case. If we go to the virtualbox.org site, in the middle of the home page, you'll see a giant download button, and this is where we want to go. It's going to bring us to the downloads page. Now, there are a number of things here that you can click on and link to and download. I just want to point out really quickly, VirtualBox extension pack is something that's really important if you are installing an operating system that uses a GUI or has a desktop environment such as Gnome, Cinnamon, Mate, so on and so forth. This comes in really handy. However, that's kind of outside the scope of this as I'm focusing specifically on a server environment that's not going to have a GUI. So we won't cover this, although I think maybe in a later video I will go over how to do this because every time I try to do it, install it onto a Debian guest machine, I often run into some obstacles. So I'll think about doing that sometime soon. But what we're really interested in today is getting the VirtualBox software onto our physical operating system, on the operating system on our physical machine. So you'll notice that at the end of a couple of these you see the word hosts. What they're telling us is this is software for the host machine. So we are down, for example, I'm using Windows 10. That will be my host machine. It will be hosting my virtualization software. And I think sometimes people might get confused because, oh, I'm installing Linux, so I need a Linux distribution. No, that's not the case. It's Windows is what I'm working with. So whatever whatever operating system you have on your physical computer is what you want to download here. The nice thing about Windows and Mac is they have an installer, so you don't really have to jump through hoops. If you are running a Linux distribution, it's a little more difficult. The instructions are pretty easy to follow. I've not had issues with it. However, I think most people, judging from YouTube statistics that visit my channel, are using either Mac or Windows. So I'm just going to focus on Windows. The Mac OS installer is probably going to work just as seamlessly as the Windows. So my expectation is you wouldn't really run into any problems here. So I'm going to go ahead and download the Windows hosts package. And now that I have it downloaded, I can just run it. I'll go ahead and open it. And then we'll get this installation wizard. I'm going to start by clicking Next. There are a number of features that can be installed. I've never really played around with this and can't really speak to it. All I know is that out of the box, the defaults work pretty well for me. I've not encountered any issues with this. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And I'm going to keep all those boxes checked. Some of them I'm not sure what they do. Register file associations, I'm just not 100% sure what they mean by that. But I've never encountered problems, so I'm going to continue to keep everything checked. And I do want a shortcut on the desktop. And here they're just telling us that we may be temporarily disconnected from the network. So if you're running something on your machine that requires constant network access, maybe this isn't a good machine to put it on. I suspect that's not the case, so it's pretty likely you can just go ahead and click yes, and then we can finally just click on the install button to install. And one thing I forgot to mention is you do need admin privileges on your system to install this, so make sure that you have those. Okay, and after a little bit, we get the installation is complete. Sure, I'll let them open up VirtualBox at the completion of the installation. So I'm going to hit finish, and I expected VirtualBox to pop up, and it did in the background there. I'm just actually going to close it. You're going to notice now on your desktop that you have an Oracle VM VirtualBox icon. You can click on that. I often run this as admin because sometimes I've run into problems where I wasn't allowed to do certain things, and it turned out to be a lack of admin privileges. I'm not sure how things are set up on the network at EOU. I don't have much to do with that. I do more with the library technology, so I'm not 100% sure. In any case, I kind of just run this now by default as admin, as an admin user, so I don't encounter any problems. Now, when you open up the software, you'll notice a screen that's very similar to this. However, yours is likely not going to have this giant list of guest machines. So each one of these are guest machines that I've created in the past. In this case, I uninstalled VirtualBox so that I could show you how quick and easy the process for installing it was. However, I still had a lot of guest machines that my all the files for those were kept on my hard drive. So it's picking those up now, which is great because I didn't actually want to lose any of these. So what we want to do now is create a new guest machine. Our computer that hosts our operating system is our host machine, and anything that we put on this VirtualBox hypervisor will be a guest machine. So it'll be using some of your host machine's resources to virtualize a computing environment, which is really kind of cool. And the process for setting up a new machine is pretty easy. All you need to do is click on this little new button up here, and we can name it. And like I had said earlier, I wanted a new base server, and what I do is I just get a very basic server, and I keep it as a guest machine. And anytime I want to try out a new open source system or some software, I just clone my base machine, my base server, and then do all the work I need to on that. So that way I don't have to go through the steps I'm about to show you every time I set up a new guest machine. So I'm going to call this base server. You can store it in anywhere you want. The VirtualBox VM's default in the user's username path works quite well for me. So I'm just going to keep it that way. Here they're asking what type of guest machine you want to install. So in this case we actually want Linux because it is the guest machine. Our host machine is Microsoft Windows. Well, in my case anyhow. So I'm going to go ahead and select Linux, and then you get to choose the distribution that you're using. Naturally, it's going to default to Oracle. Oracle owns VirtualBox. However, they've kept it open source so far. We're going to be installing Debian, and there's two choices here. You see the 32-bit and 64-bit. This really depends on your processor's architecture. Is a 32-bit architecture or is it 64-bit architecture? If you're unsure, just go with 32-bit. That will work on both 32 and 32 and 64-bit. Whereas if you choose 64-bit and you have a 32-bit machine, it's not going to run. If you're running something that has been made in the past 4 or 5 years, it's pretty likely that you'll be running 64-bit. I know that I'm running 64-bit. There are ways of checking that. You can look online to see what you're running. But I'm going to do 64-bit. If you're unsure, pick 32, or if you're running something that's really old, 32-bit is what you're going to want. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to hit next. Oh, so it looks like in one of my tests, I created this folder. Maybe I'll just call it base. You can call it whatever you want. That was specific to my situation. I did some tests with a base server and already had those files created. I could just go and delete it, but to make things easy, I'm just going to rename it base. It's not a big deal. So I'll click next. And then here we get to allocate memory size. So how much RAM are we going to give to this virtual machine? The recommended memory size here is awfully low. If you're doing server work, it probably won't be a big deal. However, I like to, if I have enough RAM, I like to allocate a good amount to my virtual machine. So in this case, I'm going to give it 4 gigabytes or so of RAM. I have 16 on this computer, so I'm okay with that. I think it's pretty standard to have about 8 these days. Allocating 4 gigabytes to this is probably okay. 2 is perfectly fine. I've encountered a little bit of slowness when I set it to 2. But between 2 and 4, you should be in good shape and not have to worry about things freezing up on you. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And so here, VirtualBox saves these guest operating systems as images, and you can use an existing image. So any of the files associated with these, I could actually use these. It wouldn't make sense to in this case because they're already here, but if somebody created like a VirtualBox snapshot of something and they sent it to you, you would use that existing hard disk file to create your virtual machine, your guest machine. I don't know what happens if you don't add a virtual hard disk. That's weird to me. I've never played around with it, so I can't really speak to that. However, we want to be sure that we create a virtual hard disk now. We're creating a completely new guest machine, so we need to create the virtual hard disk. So I'm going to keep that checked. I'm going to click on create, and here we get a number of options for the disk file type. So as I was saying earlier, each one of these has a file associated with it that VirtualBox can read and open, and it will read from machine to machine, which is great. I've actually built guest machines on a Windows host that ran on a Linux host, so this comes in pretty handy. And the file extension that's used for that is VDI, and that's the VirtualBox disk image. So I always keep this checked. I've never played around with either of these two options here, the VHD and the VMDK. However, I do kind of know what they are. So, for instance, this VHD virtual hard disk, it's actually used by Microsoft for cloning disks and that sort of thing. So you create a virtual disk. I've never actually used it, and I'm not even sure how to open it or read it or any of that. So, I'm sure there's good reasons for choosing it in some cases, but definitely not in ours. Also, this VMDK, that's just a format that will run on VMware that VMware has made openly available. Same with Microsoft with VHD. So you could create a hard drive using VMDK, and in theory, I guess you could run it on VMware, which is not what we want to do. We're going to keep this as a VirtualBox disk image. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And here we're being asked whether we want our hard disk, which we haven't allocated memory to yet, or we haven't allocated space to yet. Do we want it to be dynamically allocated, or do we want it to be fixed size? So I tend to make virtual hard drives that are in the 50 gigabyte range, and I keep it at dynamically allocated because, right off the bat I might use 8 gigabytes, and then, that's going to leave 42 gigabytes left on the hard disk. Well, if it's fixed sized, the space that you carve out on your host machine's drive will be 50 gigabytes, so it will automatically eat up that 50 gigabytes if you choose fixed size. Whereas dynamically allocated, I've got my 8 gigabytes after installation, and it's only going to take up that 8 gigabytes on the host drive. And as I add more files and programs and that sort of thing to my virtual machine, it will grow. So, I install some software that takes up a gigabyte. I now have 9 gigabytes taken out of that chunk that's been allocated onto the host machine's drive. So fixed size will run faster. However, I don't want to use space that I'm not actually using. So I'm going to keep it dynamically allocated. This is really not a big deal for test environments. I've not ever encountered any issue with it. So I'm going to keep it dynamically allocated. So we'll click Next, and so they will save the VDI file in whatever path you specify here. So this is the file that I'd be able to share with others who are running VirtualBox on other machines. So they're going to keep it here. I do want to change this, and if you're running a server, 30 gigabytes is probably fine, maybe even 20, but anything below that, you do risk eating up all that disk space pretty quick. I always use 50. I have a terabyte on this hard drive, so I'm happy with that. You could also allocate this to an external drive, but I'm just going to keep things simple and make it 50 gigabytes, and I will create that virtual hard disk right now. And that's it. We now have our virtual machine up and running. And it's really just a matter of installing the software, the Debian software, and made some minor configurations in the settings to make things work the way I want them to. But first we will need to go out and get the ISO file for Debian. So we will do that by going to our browser, and we'll go to debian.org, debian.org. And once we get to their home page, we have this download button here, which is the quick and easy way of getting an ISO file. And if you're not sure what an ISO file is, it is an optical disk image file. It's basically an archive image of a CD or a DVD. I'm not sure if it covers any other kind of media other than disk media, but you may or may not know that in the past, when you installed Linux or anything really, you would either use floppy disks if you're old like me, or CDs and DVDs. To make those installations. So the way things were kind of set up was to accept that kind of file format. And what the ISO file does is it just makes an archive of that and kind of mimics that kind of behavior that you would get from a CD or DVD. So the quick and easy way is just to hit download here. However, if you're running a 32-bit system, it kind of looks like the default is 64. I don't know if they're using some JavaScript or something to pick up on what your processor architecture is, but I think what I'm going to do is just show you the long and not easy way of getting this, just to make sure you get what you need. And you can do that by going to this more link down here, and you'll probably be at the top of the screen here. You can just scroll down to download. Go ahead and click that. And there are a number of ways you can download installation images here. So I think the one they were defaulting might have been this one. I can't remember now, but in any case, it's one of these two links is what you're going to want. Or you can get an actual DVD image and burn it to a disk. You can get a CD. It's a pain to go about things that way. I guess it would come in handy if you were installing on a physical machine rather than a virtual machine. But anytime you're using a virtual machine, these ISO files are best. You can also get a cloud image if that's your preference. But in our case, really, it's going to be one of these two. If you're unsure, go with 32-bit. Make sure you select whatever you selected when you were creating the initial virtual machine. So I talked a little bit about 32-bit and 62-bit. 32-bit will run on both 32 and 64. 64 will only run on 64. So when in doubt, go with 32. I know I have a 64-bit processor, so that's what I'm going to click on. I'm going to click on download. And actually, the download might take a minute or two, so I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay, I have my download, so I am ready to go back to VirtualBox. And at my base server here, what I need to do is go into settings, and then under storage in the left column, I want to click on that. And you'll see that this controller IDE thing here has an empty disk drive. And so what this stands for, the IDE, it's not a integrated developer's environment. It is integrated drive electronics. And this is just something that allows the computer to read from an optical disk. You can actually add a hard disk by clicking here, and actually I don't know why you would do that, and it probably has something to do with local volume management and that sort of thing. But you can add as many optical drives as you want here just by clicking on that button. We already have an empty one, and this is the one I'm going to use. So essentially what we're doing here is putting a virtual CD into a virtual CD drive. So if I click on empty, over here in the right column we get this attributes header, And what we need to do is choose the optical drive from here, or choose the CD that we want to put in, or ISO file. You can choose the ISO file that we just downloaded pretty easily by clicking on this little disk icon. And then if you go to choose a hard disk, and then if we go ahead and click on the Debian download, I downloaded the ISO file yesterday too, as I was kind of looking things over. I'm just going to go with today's, and I will do open. And for now, this is all we should really need to do in settings. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And at this point, we should be ready to start the installation. And we can do that by double-clicking on the actual guest machine. So I'll just double-click on that, and that should start things up. You could also highlight it and click on the Start button. And it's asking me to select a startup disk, and I'm not 100% sure why. I thought maybe this would just be taken care of when we did the settings and put the ISO file into the optical drive. But apparently not. So I'm just going to play things safe. I think if I hit cancel, it would probably work. But let's just play things safe and click choose virtual optical disk file. And I will click on this file that I've had here. So you see there's two things attached. There's the guest editions, which is the extensions I was talking about a little bit earlier, but we're not going to cover that today. We're only worried about getting the server up and running. We're not using a GUI, so its guest editions really isn't all that necessary. So I've highlighted it. I've clicked on it. I'm going to click choose. And then I'm going to go ahead and press start. And this should begin the process. I'm just going to clear out these things here and maybe make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so here we have the option to install things using the Graphical Installer. We can do things the old way. I'm not sure what you can do in advanced options. I'm sure it has something to do with doing additional building of the Linux kernel. I don't know that for sure, but in any case, I can speak to the differences between the graphical install and the regular install. And really the big difference is they run through the same exact thing. It's just the graphical install looks a little prettier, and it also allows you to use the mouse, so you can click on things rather than using your arrow keys and enter and all that. And honestly, I don't have a major preference on either. I think I usually use just the regular install because I got so used to it. But I'm going to go ahead and do the graphical install because I suspect that way, people can use their mouse and not have to mess around with keyboards. So it is already highlighted, and I actually think at this point you want to make sure you don't use your mouse, otherwise VirtualBox will capture it and it's kind of a pain. So you can use your arrow keys if you want to do the install, but I'm just going to go with graphical install. So it's highlighted, and I'm going to hit enter on my keyboard. And this will begin the installation process. This is a message you're going to get every time you open up the virtual machine, so I'm just going to close it and not worry about it. Let's make this larger. Let's see. So first we need to select a language, and in this case I speak English. My computer is set up to use English, but whatever your host system is using is what you're going to want to check here. And at this point I could double click on this and it'll go, or I could click continue. So we want to select our location. It looks like by default they're going to give us United States. I know that people from all over the world tend to watch this channel, so make sure you choose whatever area best suits your location. So I'm going to go ahead and do United States. The keyboard I'm using uses American English. Again, make sure you set this up to use the keyboard format that you have. I'm going to go with American English, click on continue, and the installation has begun. So this might take a couple minutes before we get to the next action screen. I'm just going to pause. So the first action window we get is to set up the host name for this system. And typically the host name in a Unix system is how it's going to be identified on your network. Now, for the most part, my network is going to be my host machine. I'm not really trying to connect to very much on our local area network. This virtual machine isn't going to be configured on our local area network to be recognized. However, it really is a good idea to put in a host name that makes sense to you. In this case, I'm just going to call this virtual machine base server. And I'm only going to use lowercase for this, and I'm not going to bother with underscores or anything like that, just to make things easier. In a Linux environment, I find it's best just to keep things lowercase for this sort of thing. So I'm going to leave it as base server, all lowercase. I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And so now we need to configure the network. And again, there's really no reason for this virtual test environment of mine to be fully recognized on our local area network. So I am not going to bother with using our domain name. Sometimes people will put localhost in here for this sort of thing. I'm just going to keep it blank. It keeps things simple. So if I go ahead and click continue, leaving the domain name blank, and the next thing we're going to start doing is setting up users and passwords. And as you may or may not know, Unix systems tend to have what's referred to as the root user. That is the user that has permission to mess with everything on the system. And in this case, what we're doing here is setting up a root password. However, I tend not to do that with my virtual environments, mostly out of laziness. And the reason is if I don't put in a root password, it will default my user, which we haven't created yet, to be a sudo user, to have root privileges. So you wouldn't be able to log into root directly. You would be able to become root as the user that you've set up. Perhaps this isn't best practice, but again, I'm doing this out of laziness. It just saves me some time in the end. If I want to create a root password later that allows me to directly log in as root, I can do that. I'm just more likely to be using my user than I would be root, so I'm not going to bother in this case. Whether or not you do is up to you. However, just know that at the end you're going to have to set up your user so that it has so that it's on the sudoers list and that it has admin privileges. So I'm going to keep things simple. I'm going to keep this blank, and I'm going to click on continue. Just know that if you do this, you won't be able to log in directly as root. So I click continue, and now I'm going to set up that user account, my user account that I was just talking about. And because I haven't given a password to root, I will be able to, I will automatically be given root privileges. So that's why I'm doing it this way. And like I said, I'm not sure if that's really best practice, but that's how I'm doing it. So here you can put in your full name for the user's name, and then I'll click on continue. And here's the suggested username for my account. For whatever reason, I prefer using this username, so I'm going to put that in. You can choose whatever you would like here. It's not a big deal. I'm going to click on continue, and then here I'll put in a password for this user that I'm creating. So it's a testing environment. I tend not to put in strong passwords for this with a test environment, just to keep it easy for me. I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And now I need to configure my clock, and you'll need to choose whatever best fits your location. I'm on the west coast of the United States, so I am using Pacific time. I'm just going to double click on that. Okay, so after a little bit, we're going to get this screen, and this goes into the realms of disk partitioning and file system formatting, which is a more advanced topic. And because I want to keep things kind of basic, I'm really trying to appeal to those who are beginners or intermediate level that just want a little bit of guidance. So I'm not going to get into disk partitioning or file disk formatting. But just know that that is something that you are able to do. I've actually honestly never gone through any of these processes here. I've always used the guided use entire disk for my test environments, well, for the most part anyway. So that's what I'm going to choose. There's really no reason as a beginner for anybody to choose these other things here. As you're learning, it's really best to go through the guided use entire disk. So that's what we'll do. I'm going to click on continue. And here we're being told that all data on the disk will be erased. And I remember the first time I encountered this years ago, I was worried that it might cause problems with my hard drive on my host machine. It will not. This is just disk space that's been allocated specifically for this guest machine. So there's no worries here. This is nothing to be concerned about. It's just telling us here that the hard disk, which is going to be identified as SDA on your Linux system, is going to be overwritten. It's going to be erased. It's going to be formatted in a way that will allow us to install Linux. If you're from a Windows environment, you'll probably have noticed that all of the hard drives and disks that are on your computer are going to be identified by, for instance, your C drive. That's the main partition that you have there. Or there might be, a D drive or a G drive or, all sorts of different drives that you'll find on a Windows system. In the Unix world, it's going to be SDA, SDB, SDC, and so on. So this is the disk that we're going to be partitioning. It's not going to affect anything on our host machine. We can go ahead and click continue. And here they're giving us a couple of options. So oftentimes in the Unix world, system administrators will separate different things, partition things differently. So it's not uncommon to have one partition for the root directory. It's not uncommon to also have a home partition. It's not uncommon to have a separate partition for var or the temp partitions or directories. So what they're doing here is they're going to do that work for you. I'm not going to bother with that. It does say, recommended for new users, all files on one partition, so we're not breaking things up. And in my test environment, that's fine. There's really no reason for me to go about this. It does come in handy later if you do these sorts of partitions. Like if you get a bad file that compromises your system in the home directory, well, it's only going to affect that. You're still going to be able to do things within your var and temp root directories and all that. So I'm just going with this all files on one partition. I'm not slicing things up in any way, just keeping it all in one place. Go ahead and click continue. And here's what our partition is going to look like. So our primary partition on the SDA drive is going to use the ext4 file format. This is kind of the default file format used in Debian distributions. There's some others out there that are available, but for the sake of simplicity, ext4 works great. It's certainly something that we're going to be able to use effectively in our guest machine. And so you'll see that this little slash here is the root directory. So we've only partitioned space for the root and everything that's associated with it. And of course, root is going to have, your home directories and var and temp and all that. You'll also notice that there was a swap space put onto that partition. We were given 1 GB of swap space. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's for when your memory, your RAM, becomes over allocated. What'll happen is all of the data that needs to be held in the volatile memory will be sent to the hard disk's swap space, and this will prevent things from crashing. So this is particularly important when you haven't allocated very much RAM onto your virtual machine. This will allow you to actually have a little bit of extra space. So at this point, things look good. Let's go ahead and click continue. Oh, I should not have highlighted the let's see. Okay, so I'm going back, I'm highlighting this, and I'm going to click continue. And again, they're asking me, why are they asking me to do this over again? I think we need to go back to guided partitioning. So I'm going to go ahead and click continue, use the entire disk, all file, yeah, so kind of going through the work again here. Oh, I see. So I needed to select the finish partitioning and write changes to disk rather than clicking on other things and trying to show you all everything. I redid everything. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on finish partitioning and write changes to the disk and continue. And yes, we want the changes to be made. So I'm going to pause while the base system is being installed. It should take a couple seconds. Okay, after a minute or two, you should get this window where we will begin configuring the package manager. Right now, what they're telling us is if we are using a CD or DVD, in some cases you may need multiple CDs or DVDs to install on a physical drive. That's not the case for us. We're using the single ISO file, so we don't need to put in another DVD or CD at this point. I think this is, something that you would do if you were trying to do everything offline, and we're doing everything online. So in this case, it's not really pertinent to us. So we're going to leave it as no and click on continue. And now what they're doing is they want us to find a mirror of the Debian archive that is close to you on your network, or close to your network, the network you're using. So it's really important to choose the area that is closest to you. So in my case, I live in the United States. I'm going to select United States and click on continue. And so here, what we need to do is choose our mirror. And of course, they don't really tell you where these things are. So it may be a matter of doing a Google search to find out what is closest to you. If you're unsure, I would just go with the deb.debian.org. It's the default, so you can go with that. However, I know that Oregon State University has an open source software lab where they maintain a mirror, and I'm going to select that. And it's probably good to note that this is important because the way you install software or easily install software on Linux is through a repository. So rather than getting an executable file or downloading an executable file to your machine like you would with Windows, and with Windows you would download it, you'd click it, and it would install on your machine. This goes out to the internet and grabs the software and brings it back and installs it. And with Debian, we tend to use the apt package manager. If you're using Red Hat, you'd be using DNF or Yum or something like that. Or if you're using Arch, you would use the Pacman manager. But in the realms of Debian, we tend to use apt. And so by selecting this Debian mirror at the Oregon State University, this is where my apt package manager is going to go to grab all of the software when I run the sudo apt install command. So I'm going to go ahead and select this because I know it's closest to me. I don't have any proxy information that I need to fill in here. It's pretty unlikely you will need anything here either. Again, this is mostly for test environments, so it's really not super important for me to get out anywhere that would require a proxy. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave this blank because I don't need a proxy, and click continue. And our configuration of the apt package manager has begun. I'm going to pause while this does its thing. Okay, so next we get the popularity contest configuration, and what this is it allows Debian developers to get notifications, and I like that idea. Of course, maybe some people might find it to be somewhat invasive. However, I really like the idea of contributing as much as I possibly can to the open source community. The folks that develop these things, I feel should have all of the information that they need to make a great system. So I'm happy to go ahead and click yes here. You don't need to click that. You can just stick with no if you're more comfortable with that. I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And now we get this software selection. And I really want a minimal machine. I don't want a desktop environment, so I'm not going, this is purely a server, so I'm going to uncheck that desktop environment box. If you're more comfortable using a GUI, and there's nothing wrong with that, particularly if you're learning this stuff or just starting to learn this stuff, I found the desktop environments to be really helpful in wrapping my head around things. So many of my first test environments did use a desktop specifically for that reason. So, if you do go ahead with that, it does get a little more complicated in terms of setting up guest editions, but I want this to just be a server. And honestly, every one of these have been pretty great desktops. I've played around with all of them, but if you need like a lightweight Desktop, the LXDE is pretty good. The XFCE is pretty good too. I don't want a print server, so I'm not going to bother with that, despite the fact that much of what I'm going to do requires a web server. I'm not going to bother with that. If you clicked on this, I think it would install Apache. It might install some other things. I do like to keep the standard system utilities checked. And I also like to SSH into my servers, so I'm just going to click that so it's right off the bat. This way I don't have to go in and do sudo install or sudo apt install open SSH. It's already installed for me. So at this point, it's pretty minimal. It's everything that I want. I'm going to click on continue, and it is installing software. I'm just going to pause while it does its thing. Okay, after a bit we're going to be presented with the Grub bootloader window, and so this is just the piece of software that allows your system to boot. And of course they're not finding any other operating systems on this computer because it is a virtual disk. We can just go ahead with this. I suspect if you clicked no, then you would be able to choose another bootloader. I know there's a couple of them out there for Linux. I've just never used anything other than Grub, so I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to keep it set to yes, and then I'll go ahead and click continue. And here we need to choose where the Grub bootloader is going to live on the hard disk. Now we didn't partition, I forgot to mention earlier that oftentimes you can do a boot partition as well. So that way, if something goes wrong with the Grub bootloader, it's not going to affect any of your other directories. So having a boot partition is something that many Linux administrators will do. But again, this is all for testing purposes. This is all for educational purposes. So we don't need to worry about that. And because we selected the whole disk to partition, we can do that here. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. I'm not actually sure what would be involved with entering the device manually, but we don't need to worry about that. More advanced topic for more advanced videos. So I've selected my hard disk, SDA1. I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And now we're getting the Grub bootloader installed. So I'll pause as this does its thing. Okay, and after a little bit we have finished the installation. They're telling us to remove the installation media. I'm not sure how you would go about doing that in a virtual machine, so I'm just going to go ahead and click continue. It's finishing the installation and it's rebooting. And it looks like things are working as they should. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter there. Okay, so here I am on the login screen for my base server. I had set up my user as jKellogg, so I'm going to put that in as my login name. I'll put in the password. And at this point, I am up and running on my new base server. But of course, there's a couple of settings I want to point out in VirtualBox itself that I use, and there's really not many of them, but I use them all the time and they're very helpful. So I'm going to show you that now, and in order to actually make those settings happen, I'm going to have to shut down. So we will run sudo shutdown now, and of course if you did present root with a password, this isn't going to work. We're just going to run this as a sudo user. Sudo shutdown now. Go ahead and hit enter. And here we get the usual lecture. The first time you use sudo, you usually get this little message just letting you know that you need to respect the privacy of others, because you can look at everything as a sudo user on a system. Think before you type, because you can break things very easily as root user. And with great power comes great responsibility. Kind of goes back to the think before you type sort of thing. So I'm just going to put in my password here. Restarting things, or shutting down things. And I guess I should open up VirtualBox again. Okay, so you'll see the power is off on my base server. And what I want to do at this point is change a couple of settings. And you can do that a couple of ways. You could either click on settings up here, or you could just right click on the virtual machine and go into settings that way. And the things that I want to point out, one is in this general section here. So you'll notice there's an advanced tab. I'm going to click on that. And here you'll see there is the possibility for a shared clipboard, which will allow you to copy and paste from the host machine to the guest machine and from the guest machine to the host machine. Now it's currently disabled, and because I want it bidirectional, I'm going to choose bidirectional. You could just set it up so that only the host could give, you could copy something from the host and paste it to the guest, but not from the guest to the host. That doesn't work for me. So I choose bidirectional. And another thing I use is the drag and drop, but that's more for a GUI, a graphical user interface, or a GUI. But I'm just going to set it anyway. It's a server, so there's, I'm going to be using nothing but the terminal in this case. So I'm going to set that to bidirectional. Now the other thing I want to point out is I like to SSH into my server. So I like to use one bash shell to connect to my servers to get a terminal on those servers, another shell on those servers. And to do that, you use secure shell. And you may have noticed that earlier, as we were setting things up, as we were installing Debian, I chose to include the SSH functionality. So I don't need to install OpenSSH. Everything is ready to go. However, it's not going to work with the way I have things configured for network settings. So we're going to go here to our network settings, and the default is NAT. And honestly, I forget what that means, but I do know that it works really well for getting out to the internet. It allows your virtual machine to communicate through your host machine very easily to access other networks. Unfortunately, this does not work so well with SSH. So in order for me to be able to SSH into my servers, and the reason I feel that's important is because I don't like the VirtualBox terminal. The functionality is not as robust as what you get from using a bash shell or from using PuTTY. So I need to set things up so that it's a bridged adapter. And I guess what this allows on my local area network is for my guest machine to communicate in more robust ways through my host machine. And one important thing to note here is if you're at work, your employer may have set things up so that you can only have internet traffic going through one device on the port you're connected to. So if you select bridged adapter and you find that you can't access the internet, it really is a matter of calling your IT department and saying, hey, I've got this virtual machine that I want to SSH into, but I need to be able to have more than one device on my port communicate with the internet. So setting up the bridged adapter is something that I have to do for all of my machines because I want to SSH into them. If you're not doing SSH, it's not a big deal. You could leave it as NAT, but if you're following along with my videos and you want to SSH into things, you're going to have to select bridged adapter. So it's selected. I'm going to click OK. And at this point, things should be good. I can go ahead and start my system. Those little failure messages I'm getting, I always get them in virtual environments, and I've never looked into why. Things work, so I tend not to worry about it, but I suspect if you see them, you're kind of wondering, what's up with that? Well, probably something I should look into, but haven't. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here again, and put in my password. Okay, so in order to SSH into this machine, I need to know what the IP address is, and I can do that with this command, IP address. And then down here, and actually this is a really good example of why I hate the VirtualBox terminal. So when I go here to copy and paste the iNet IP address, which is the 10.3, I wanted to highlight that to show you, but I can't do that because of this terminal. And maybe there's a way to do that I haven't figured out. I suspect it involves, mouse capturing in the virtual environment. but I've just never really looked into making this better. So as an example of how I go about this, I run this IP address command, and then I open up another VM that I use for all of the SSHing and server work that I need to do. And of course, this has a GUI on it, so things are going to look a little different. And I'm here on my login screen, so I'll log in. And what I'm running here is Debian 10 with a Gnome Desktop. Gnome tends to be a very robust sort of desktop. Probably not the best choice for if you're trying to run lightweight environments, but I do really like the functionalities that come with it. Maybe at some point I'll do a video on that. But in any case, what I'm going to do is just SSH into the server just to make sure it's working the way it's supposed to. And let's see, I want to bring this up here. And the reason for that is I need the IP address. So let's see. If I do SSH jkellogg at the IP address that we find here, so I've got 10.3.20.13. I go ahead and hit enter. Whoops, I messed that up. A little typo there. 13, and I'll hit enter. And so here they're just making sure we're okay with our machine connecting to the machine we want to connect to. It hasn't really established a connection before, so anytime you're trying to establish with a new server, you're going to be asked whether or not you want to continue connecting. And of course I do, so I'm going to do yes. And now you'll see that, so they're asking for the password. I just need to put in the password for this guest machine that I'm trying to log into here. And you'll see that I am now in the base server, and I'm using a bash shell, and that makes me happier. So, before my host name was jkellogg dev, and then I SSH'd into the base server that we just created. So everything is working the way I want it to right now, and I think I'm good for cloning this server and doing the work that I need to for any open source system or anything I want to play around with as a test environment. So I hope you found this content useful. And of course, if there's any sort of open source systems, particularly relating to libraries, that you would like to learn how to install or would like some kind of tutorial on, let me know. I'm happy to consider anything that comes my way, and we'll often do videos on things that I'm able to. So I thank you for watching. If this is content that you would like to see more of, please subscribe to my channel. If you like the content of this video, please like, and hopefully I will see you in subsequent videos. Thanks.